Good evening to all those watching. My name is Shweta Kothari, and we are here to talk about Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose today. Known as India's foremost nationalist, his life can be best described as dramatic by some, so much so that there is curiosity till date. He resigned from the Indian civil services to join the Indian freedom movement and was exiled twice for more than 7 years, fought against the British rule, evaded the intelligence network in India, and finally, up till his mysterious death in a span of 20 years, created history like no one. We are joined today, and we're privileged to be joined today by Chandrachur Ghosh, whose latest book, Bose, The Untold Story of an Inconvenient Nationalist, is being talked about by the academics, amongst historians, and of course, the followers of Subhash Chandra Bose. Congratulations, Mr. Ghosh, for a spectacular victory on that book, and the book has hit the shelves now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that.
Remember, it was released on the occasion of the 125th birth anniversary of Subhash Chandra Bose, and with the book, Ghosh has attempted to draw attention towards the unexplored aspects of Bose's life. Now, Ghosh has also explored Netaji's thoughts on independent India's developments, the problems with communalism back then, geopolitics, the political ideology of Netaji, and how he was able to negotiate with political parties, with revolutionary societies back then, and the government of that day. Now, Bose's legacy, as we know, is mixed. Among many in India, he's a muscular hero. To others, he was a fascist sympathizer. So what exactly is his history and what was his vision for India? To talk about all of that and more, I want to first get you, sir, on if Bose was alive and if he saw India getting independence and had his vision prevailed, how would India be different today?
That's a very difficult and complex question, Shweta. And essentially, we'll have a lot of speculative elements because we are speculating about something that didn't happen and what could happen. But nonetheless, it's worth thinking about it. The alternative that could have been but didn't happen. Now, if Bose really came back along with the captured INA soldiers in towards the end of 1945 or even early 1946, as many among your audience know, that the tremendous reaction that the trial of the INA soldiers produced, the Red Fort trial of Shahnawaz Khan, Gurbakh Singh Dhillon, and P.K. Sehgal, the trial, the INA trial, the mass upsurge that it produced. If three soldiers' trial could produce that reaction, just having Netaji on India's soil at that time, one can well imagine what kind of reaction it would have sparked. I mean, the British Raj at that time probably would have faced a revolution, nothing short of a revolution. There would have been a flow of resistance and an upheaval. But that didn't happen, sadly. But let us assume that he was there at that time. Had he been there, what would have happened? The exit of the British Raj would have been quicker. Number one can very easily say that because when the trials were underway, the trials of the Iron Soldiers were underway, the British government of India and the British government in London, they were mortally afraid of how the INA trials were impacting the British Indian army, the Indian soldiers in the British Indian army, that they were gradually turning sympathetic to the INA soldiers. They had no clear conception of what the INA was. In India, nobody knew what the INA was, the Azadin government was, what exactly Subhash Bose was doing in Southeast Asia. Now, as the war ended, all this news started coming in, filtering in, slowly trickling in. And then when people got to know of it, they were so overwhelmed, so much overtaken by the heroic efforts of the INA and the soldiers. Even the Indian army, the British Indian army became sympathetic. They started collecting funds for the benefit of the families of these INA soldiers who were imprisoned at that time. They were suffering a lot of adverse situations. So a lot of things, and we see intelligence, tons of intelligence briefs, secret letters being exchanged between the commander-in-chief, between the viceroy and the government in London about the unreliability, the growing unreliability. They were not able to trust the Indian soldier anymore. So we find Auchinleck asking for British troops, pure British troops, no mixture of Indian soldiers there to hold the fort in India. And obviously, he was asked to justify why are you thinking that? I mean, the British government was telling him that we are already stretched with our resources, and we need to understand why you are asking that. So Auchinleck explains that if there is a riot in India now, or if there is an uprising by the people now, the Indian soldiers in the British army are going to side with the people, and in secret, they were creating the exit plans, and that made actually the prime minister at that time very angry. He ridiculed Auchinleck later in his autobiography that I mean our men in India were preparing exit plans. I mean, not exit plans, escape plans. So they drew actually worked out routes by which in the Britishers present in India would be collected from key centers and taken out of India. How quickly that could be done. So if that was the situation, then the prolonged negotiation that happened, the behind the doors negotiation, compromises that led to the partition of India, none of them perhaps would have taken place. That much was certain because there was and the Muslim League, which created the biggest obstacle to an united India, and they kept threatening and creating problems in the negotiations towards transfer of power. That the Muslim League wouldn't have been so powerful because the Muslim soldiers coming back with the INA, they were so enthused, so inspired by Bose's ideal, by Bose's personality, that they had almost forgotten to think like Muslims the way Muslim League wanted them to think. So they were like true Indians. They were not able to understand the divisions based on religion, what kind of negotiations were going back. And the best example of that was Muhammad Ali Jinnah offered one of the INA trials, Shanwaz Khan, uh, to defend him and to uh, support him, provided he joined the Indian Muslim League. And Shanwaz Khan refused. So all these were happening. Later on, I mean, somebody who would later on go on to become the first prime minister of independent Bangladesh, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Mujibur Rahman was an upcoming leader of the Muslim League at that time. And later on, he wrote in his autobiography that at that time, people like us were in a dilemma. We used to hear speeches of Netaji from Southeast Asia, and we used to cheer for him. We used to long for his return to India. But the other thought that used to trouble me at that time was that if he comes back, then there will be no Pakistan. So, as a Muslim League worker, he was in a dilemma. As an Indian, he wanted Subhash Bose to come back. As a Muslim League worker, he was worried that the Pakistan wouldn't work out. So that was the kind of impact, influence that Subhash Bose would have had in 46, 47. So
Mhm.
independence would have come in a much more straightforward way. The exit of the British Raj would have happened in a much more cleaner cleaner exit, not the secrecy around and secret clauses, compromises in the transfer of power agreements and all. So a lot more, India would have appeared to be a lot more self-reliant and much more in command of the situation had we come back in 1945-46.
Okay. Okay. So, from my understanding of it, from a layman's perspective, it appears that India would have come out more stronger had he been alive at the time of independence.
Absolutely.
My question to you, sir, in which cases, because we know for a fact that he had differences within the Indian National Congress, he had differences with Mahatma Gandhi. He was emerging out to be a very strong leader. Had he been alive, there would have obviously been a tussle for power. But what kind of political union do you think he envisioned India to be? Would he have been a liberal Democrat or an autocratic extremist? Because to some, he wanted to collect power and he wanted to be at the helm of the power as he was alive.
Yeah. So Subhash Bose is best described as the elephant, the proverbial elephant which was to the four blind men. So somebody touched the legs and thought it was a pillar. Somebody touched the trunk, thought it was a rope. It was something else. Someone touched the tail and thought it was a rope. So Subhash Bose appeared different things to different people. So while some were scared that he had turned a fascist, some others were afraid that he was too much of a communist. The communists themselves thought that he was eating into their constituency, and from that position, they opposed Subhash Bose. So it was the uniqueness of Bose was that nobody could put him into a neat box of ism. The only ism that he could fit into was nationalism, and everything else was subservient to India's national interests. Now, coming to the form of his vision of India, he had a very clear conception of what India should be after freedom, and he started talking about it right from 1928 when he entered the active pan-Indian politics. Before that, he was active in politics, but much more in a regional scale in Bengal as an assistant to Deshbandhu Chittaranjan Das, and was roaming around, but not as a uh, uh, decided leader. From 1928, his emergence in the national scenario began, and that's when he started talking about his vision. So he spoke about a number of things, and for example, science and technology would take a front seat that would drive the education of the current generation to remove superstitions, the values of the old, like casteism, caste and creed, and suppression of different groups by other superior groups. So all those caste divisions and everything, they had to go. There was no doubt in his mind about that. Then he wanted India's development path to be industry based because of the widespread poverty and lack of health infrastructure and everything. The way forward was heavy industrial development. And in this, there was actually very little difference in the economic thinking between Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Bose. They were pretty close to each other philosophically, political philosophy wise, and economically more so, economic thought wise. And then he had a very strong uh, views on development of military capabilities, India's own military capabilities. And that is one thing which he constantly emphasized. And that's one of the reasons why many people take him to be a militaristic, aggressive leader. But he was far from so. He wanted India to be a union, a single, undivided India. Of course, he fought against partition tooth and nail from whatever he could do from the faraway Southeast Asia. He constantly broadcast his speeches arguing against partition, appealing, literally begging to Gandhi and Jinnah and Savarkar that just drop your communal differences. This is a ploy by the British Raj to divide India to serve their own interests. So don't get into their trap. Don't let India get partitioned. Don't divide India. So that wouldn't have happened. That he wouldn't let happen, and that he could keep different communities together. And this he spoke beautifully that one of the missions of India. India has been charged by Providence with a mission that it has to it has to demonstrate to the world that different groups, different ethnic groups, different religious groups can be brought together and they can live harmoniously. And that is by showing that India will lead the world. So it, there are some beautiful elements in this, and these are far from being militaristic, autocratic, dictatorial image that has been created about him. And of course, he wanted a very strong center. He wanted a very strong center, at least initially for a few years after independence. And strong center was justified by him uh, by citing the Sisyphus tendencies. The there were multiple forces which were trying to go in different directions. So there were forces like Muslim League. There were forces like the Indian states. The Indian states wanted their own agenda or own independence and own space. They didn't want to be a part of the Indian Union, a problem which was faced by the independent government, particularly which had to be dealt with with a heavy hand by Sardar Patel later on. So he argued for a very strong central government, and at the same time, he said that each uh, region and each group will have the maximum autonomy that is possible under any unitary constitution. So we'll have a federal republic. It will be a free, independent federal republic with its own flag, with its own military, with its own economic policy, and each constituting group will have the maximum amount of autonomy. They will have their freedom to pursue their cultural interests, to pursue their religious interests, and everything. But also, there was a need for strict discipline. Now, this discipline was an element which makes him stand out from the contemporary leaders, his peers. He was a stickler for discipline. We don't see that insistence on discipline amongst any other leaders. Of course, Gandhiji would insist on that the Congress workers at least should uh, give in heart and soul to his plan of satyagraha, becoming a satyagrahi, how to become a satyagrahi. He had a plan, he had a description, and he demanded that Congress workers should stick to that. But Subhash's idea of conception of discipline was broader. It was not about only one single plan. It was as a human being, as an Indian, we need to be much more disciplined. And that discipline would perhaps require, inculcating that sense of discipline would perhaps require a military training for the younger generation and a stronger framework of law and order. So, to make India fit for democracy, to understand the values of democracy, I mean, he understood that there is a very thin line between chaotic, anarchical state of affairs and democracy. So often people tend to celebrate the fact that this might be a messy democracy, but we are a messy, we're a democracy nonetheless. So I mean, it's nice for intellectuals and probably media persons to talk like that. But for the common people who have to go and queue up and get some work done and face the hell for it, uh, democracy works there. So even when you cannot stand in a proper queue, that's the democracy. That's a sense. That's the value of democracy. You don't jump the queue, don't push the other person out of the queue. I mean, at a very transactional level, that is the value of democracy. Unless you develop that respect and that sense of discipline, democracy is not going to work. And that was his argument. So, but he made it very clear. He said that these are my points of view, and I am placing these in front of the people. But ultimately, when India becomes free, it is absolutely up to the people of India to choose for themselves which model they choose, which model they prefer. I'm not going to impose anything on anybody.
Okay. You know, something very interesting you said. You said uh, Bose was close to Jawaharlal Nehru in more than one ways, politically and in fact in his economic ideology as well. I want to bring about the politics of it and then maybe go to the economics of it. So politically, you said that Bose envisioned an India where states were more powerful, more federal, but the center would be at power or maybe more powerful than the states for a period to come.
Correct.
If that is my correct understanding of it. So initially central should be more powerful. Going forward, it should be a absolute federal country as opposed to the quasi-federal country that we enjoy in today. In more than one ways, you say he was close to Jawaharlal Nehru. In what more ways are you talking about when you say politics of it? And I want you to talk about politics of Bose at this point in time. How was he more closer to Netaji? And you know, it is surprising to a lot of people because Netaji today is considered to be a militaristic leader, someone more nationalistic than perhaps when compared to Jawaharlal Nehru. But you're clearing the air here as far as his political ideology and his economic ideology is concerned.
Yeah. See, there are two parts to your question, and I will answer them separately. First, let me tell you how close they were. Uh, Nehru was somewhat a little more senior than Subhash in terms of joining the Congress. He joined a little earlier than Bose did, a few years earlier. And he had come closer to Gandhi. Nehru had come closer to Gandhi and was developing under his shadow practically. Now, in terms of mental makeup, both of them were had a very good uh, a baseline or a foundation on the Western values of democracy, secularism, and the pattern of education. And so all these were very common factors, and their mental makeup was quite similar. And as a result, they came close very quickly. So both Nehru and Bose started working together. We see from 1928. So they raised the demand for independence in the Calcutta Congress resolution. They opposed Gandhi when Gandhi goes with the Nehru report's recommendation of dominion status. So Bose stands up and opposes Gandhi. Nehru stands up and opposes Gandhi. Gandhi is livid, and then gradually Nehru gives in. So then, when Subhash goes to exile in Europe, Nehru also reaches there after, as his wife was ill. Bose takes care of Nehru's wife, Kamala Nehru, in Europe, and they spend some time together there. And then the closeness grows. In 1928, they had formed an organization together called Independence of India League. So Bose and Nehru formed. The third person who was at the top leadership of that in IIL at that time was somebody who became the president of India later on, Zakir Hussain. So they have their closeness increased, and as Subhash was planning to come back to India from his exile by defying the ban imposed by the British government, he was constantly consulting Nehru that what should I do? I want to go back. Should I go back? So and Nehru is telling him that look, I cannot ask you to get arrested and then face prison and suffer the consequences. But had I been in your position, probably I would have done that. And then Bose comes back to India defying the ban, gets arrested as expected. Nehru announces an All India Subhash Day to celebrate his arrest. And then Nehru was president of the Congress when Bose came back in 1936. In 1937, again, Nehru is elected the Congress president. So that in 1937, when Bose is released, he starts working very closely with Nehru. Then in 1938, Bose becomes the president of the Congress, and then they keep working. And it is here that gradually the difference starts emerging in 1938. The differences start emerging, the differences which were below the surface. So, for example, when Jawaharlal Nehru went to Europe, he developed a very good network of international socialists and revolutionaries, including Indians who were living there at that time, like Virendranath Chattopadhyay, brother of Sarojini Naidu. And he was fondly called Chatto. So Chatto was a very well-known communist leader at the time, and Indian revolutionary, permanently posted abroad. So he was never back in India. He was either in Brussels or in Moscow or in Berlin, so roaming around doing Indian revolution abroad. So as Bose comes up and draws up his radical program, we find there's a very strange letter from Chatto to Nehru telling him that you have to be careful about Bose. He is a reactionary, and he is coming up with his radical program, but essentially he's a reactionary, so be careful. So people were already there who were driving a wedge between the two. And Bose, although was very fond of Nehru, he wrote at that a little later, that you are the one among the younger generation, among the younger leaders, to whom we look up to. You are like an elder brother. We look up to you for leadership, for guidance. But in his book, The Indian Struggle, his story of the Indian freedom movement, he is scathing in Nehru's criticism that Nehru, although despite his modern views and modern ideas and revolutionary radical ideas, uh, starts a movement or starts a program, plans something, and then when the diktat comes from Gandhi, he completely ditches his own ideas and everything, throws them away, and goes and surrenders at the feet of Gandhi. So, and he was very strong in his language about Nehru. And the good thing was, Nehru read all this criticism with great dispassion, and himself made some corrections that you have made some mistakes here, you have made some mistakes here, so please correct them in the next edition. So that kind of relation they had till the late 1930s, till the mid 1930s rather. Nehru had a problem with Subhash's leftism because Subhas's leftism was not typical Western materialist Marxian variety. His leftism, he was leftist in his economic thoughts, but his grounding was much stronger in Indian past. And he came up again and again and again about the glory of the Indian past because his argument was that as an Indian, if you are not proud of your heritage, if you are not proud of your history, then you cannot build your future. The British government has denationalized us. Now we have to get rid of that. And to get rid of that and to rebuild our country, we have to relearn about our past and be proud of it. So he used to use terms like our country has a mission. He used to use imagery of the mother when he used to talk about India, the motherland, and all. Now, this part was not liked by either Nehru or someone like Bhagat Singh. So Bhagat Singh also complained to Nehru that, I mean, Subhash Babu keeps talking about this stuff, and this is so vague. I don't understand what he means and all. So they were so on the one hand, all of them were talking about socialism, all of them were talking about economic restructuring in socialistic lines and all. But Subhas had a very large component of spiritualism in his thoughts, which were missing in both Bhagat Singh and Jawaharlal Nehru. So these differences came up later on when the fight began, when the conflict began between Bose and Nehru. Then uh, Subhas had he was his own person. Although he would respect and guide Nehru, look for guidance from Nehru at the early phases. Later on, he developed his own program. He had his own thoughts how to do it. He was more involved directly with the revolutionary societies, the secret societies across the country, in Punjab, in Northwest Frontier Province, in Maharashtra, in Uttar Pradesh, in eastern part of Bengal. So he was trying to bring all this together and create a force which at some point of time would start a revolution. And that's why he would criticize the revolutionaries for their their actions, which were called actions at the time. So killing one district magistrate or bombing one train. He said that nobody has created a revolution with one and a half revolvers and half a bomb. So if you think that you will uproot the British Raj just by throwing a bomb at somebody, you are mistaken. Preserve your energy, think through, organize yourself, and prepare for a large scale mass action, not individual acts. So, with that aim, he started building up a volunteer corps. And one of the organizations that represented this volunteer corps was named Bengal Volunteers. And this actually scared the British administrators in Bengal and in other provinces. They were absolutely uh, petrified of these volunteer corps. That what is this Suva's plan? What are they doing? What are their aims? And they were constantly the spies were following, tailing them, their leaders. So there were differences like this. And when Subhas finally ran into a conflict on the economic program with Gandhiji, as a president of the Congress, he proposed a heavy industrial reconstruction program and set up the planning committee, the National Planning Committee, the precursor of the Planning Commission in Free India, and made Nehru the chairperson of the planning committee. So the Gandhians were not happy about it. They thought that the small scale cottage industry were being neglected or the charkha was being neglected. So Subhas had to assure them that this is not the case. But nonetheless, the Gandhians were never happy. In fact, when Subhas was being elected the president, not selected, he was not elected in 1938. Presidents were always selected at that time. The first election, in fact, took place in 1939. Uh, when he was being selected, Gandhiji wrote to Vallabhbhai Patel that uh, Subhas is not at all trustworthy. But unfortunately, there is nobody else this year who can become the president. So they just tolerated Subhas for 1 year, and then the confrontation broke through, and the Gandhians went against him. In that fight, Nehru tried to remain neutral for some time, but then he was too closely tied up with Gandhiji to break ranks with him and move towards Subhash. So, and very interestingly, much later, towards the end of Nehru's life, uh, there was a journalist called Taya Zinkin. Taya Zinkin was the wife of one of the last Indian civil servants, a top-ranking Indian civil servant, and she was a journalist. She conducted an interview of Nehru and asked him, "Do you think that you let down Subhash?" And Nehru had to admit that I have to admit that I let him down because the choice before me at that time was between Gandhi and Subhash. And for me, Gandhi meant India. And I couldn't have left Gandhi, whatever that meant, whatever were the consequences. Although I agreed with Subhash on more points, but there was no way I was going to side with him. So these are very complex dynamics going on.
So more,
Uh,
more nuanced than perhaps what we see today on social media, what we know coming up, propping up every now and then on social media. The relationship between Netaji and Jawaharlal Nehru was much, much more nuanced than what
Much
we
more nuanced, but much more nuanced, but also towards the end, from 1939 onwards, it became very hardened. They took very, very hardened stance on the both sides, other sides, each other, both sides of the fence, and took didn't look at each other kindly. So we find Subhas writing a 27-page letter to Nehru, completely demolishing his political position during the last 1.5 years. That letter was written in April, probably April 1939. So during the entire presidency, when Jawaharlal Nehru writes a very kind of uh, mushy kind of, not mushy really, but a very vague kind of charges against Subhash. Subhash completely loses his cool and writes a 20-page 7 letter showing the flaws of Nehru's policies and everything. So Nehru doesn't retaliate in that manner, yeah, because at the very beginning he says, "I accept your charges against me, and I'm not going to get into an argument over that." But then he also had his complaints against Subhash, which he also listed down. But as things moved on, there was something which Subhas wrote actually, which was extremely damning. He wrote to his elder brother Sharath, and I would like to read it out. And because this is something that should come out, and as the end piece of the relation, many people are focused only on the enmity between Bose and Nehru, and the Congress historians particularly try to portray that they were very pally and they were very close friends. Particularly historians from Bose's own family who have been attached with the Congress party, they also want to show it like that. But things had hardened, as I said, towards 1939. And let me read this. And this he writes. Subhash is writing in 1939 to his elder brother Sharat. The more I think of Congress politics, the more convinced I feel that in future we should devote more energy and time to fighting the High Command. If power goes into the hands of such mean, vindictive, and unscrupulous persons when Swaraj is won, what will happen to the country? If we don't fight them now, we shall not be able to prevent power passing into their hands. So this is a damning statement on the entire Gandhian High Command. And about
I'm
Gandhiji's,
hearing I'm hearing the word unscrupulous, and I think there is a lot more emphasis on that, on the word unscrupulous people leading the country. Quite surprising, sir, especially when it comes to economics of it, because at some point I read, and you've also written that Bose was one among those who looked at socialism as an alternate to nationalistic policies, and in fact followed Jawaharlal Nehru at a point when he was trying to talk about socialism, when they were all as a bunch unhappy with Gandhi at that point.
yeah. So as I said, that the difference was that all of them were socialists in their program, in the economic program. Suhas took the program a few steps ahead of Nehru, when Nehru could take it or talk about it. So once he became the president of Congress, and at that time, the uh, Congress party had come to power in 8 out of 11 provinces. because resulting from the elections of 1935, the new constitution that was implemented in 1935. So the elections took place in 1937, and the Congress government, state governments came to power. And as the Congress president, Subhash asked the Indian capitalists, the Indian entrepreneurs, that we have Congress governments in 8 provinces. You should take advantage of that and build up a national industry, a national economy. Why should everything be dominated by the British companies, by the British forces? This is your chance, and take advantage of it. Our states are formulating favorable policy, so you come ahead and do it. And to follow, he set up meetings of the industries ministers of these provinces. He set up meetings for the planning committee, and he cajoled and coaxed Nehru, who was unwilling to take the position of the chairperson of the planning committee, laid down the broad contours, the guidelines, and gave them a direction. So, although Nehru was, of course, he was talking about leftist economics and leftist policies and the socialistic pattern of economy, but Subhas was actually he was walking the talk more than anybody else was doing at the time. So that was a big difference, and that was also a key source of his conflict with the Gandhians.